Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. And today we're gonna hear from the United Nations about financial reports, and we already heard from the Secretary General about how the war in Ukraine is putting a strain on financial systems, food systems, and energy systems around the world, and how it is having an effect on inflation in different countries. We're going to hear again a report from the Deputy Secretary about an actual report on what is going on with fuel, what is going on with food, and how it is having an effect on multiple nations in regards to inflation. Canada and U.S. only being two of the countries that it is actually having an effect on. We're also going to hear a report from the Bank of Canada, where they are actually raising 50 points, the interest rate for 50 points, and the reason behind why they need to do that, because they need to bring the inflation rate back to about 2%. They're trying to anchor it to that 2% so that the inflation doesn't have a dramatic effect on goods, the distribution of goods, and how much the Canadian people actually have to pay for goods when they go to a store. So we're going to hear from the Bank of Canada over that. Also, we're going to hear from the Defense Minister Anita Anand, as she makes an announcement about sending troops and humanitarian efforts to Poland to assist in humanitarian efforts in because of the war in Ukraine. They are talking about, of course, different types of goods that will actually provide aid to the Ukrainian people, the refugees, as they are leaving and trying to escape the fighting. And they're also talking about some of the things, non-lethal aid to the Ukrainian military, such as cameras for drones and other things that they're trying to contract from Canadian manufacturers to help Ukrainian people gain control of their country and stop the fighting the attacks are coming from Russia. So let's listen to what everyone has to say.
Good morning. Good morning, and we want to welcome the Deputy Secretary General who's here with us, and joining her is Naveed Hanif from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. They are here to present you the Financing for Sustainable Development Report 2022, which you should all have. DSG, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Shall I take it easy? There we go. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this important launch. I'm pleased to present the 2022 Financing for Sustainable Development Report. The report is produced by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs in collaboration with more than 60 international agencies, including the UN system and international financial institutions. This report is coming at a critical moment for humanity. It's adding to the compounding crises of climate, assaults on our natural systems, and the protracted COVID-19 pandemic. The fallout from the war in Ukraine is rapidly impacting food, energy, and finance across the globe, and without immediate policy action, the window for delivering on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will close. Yet, instead of action, once again, we're seeing the countries the least responsible for any crisis paying the highest price. An estimated 77 million people were living in extreme poverty compared to before the pandemic. People in the world's poorest economies are increasingly bearing the brunt of climate-related economic losses. Our analysis indicates that 1.7 billion people are facing exposure to spiking food, energy, and fertilizer costs as a result of the war in Ukraine. To address these proliferating global threats and ensure developing countries are not left behind, the Secretary General has mobilized a global crisis response group working to address the fallout on food, energy, and finance. The crisis group will also aim to tackle a key enabler of the cascading crises currently taking place, a global financial system that favors the rich and punishes the poor. During COVID-19, while developed countries were able to borrow at ultra-cost interest rates to support their economies, developing countries found themselves faced with both shrinking fiscal space and prohibitively high borrowing costs in the market. As a result, many were forced to cut spending in areas critical to the SDGs, such as social protection, health, education systems, and decent jobs, all needed to end the pandemic, to increase resilience to future shocks and provide the foundation for prosperity. It is creating a legacy of inequality that will not only undermine countries' ability to survive future crises, while sowing the seeds for greater discontent and instability. Ladies and gentlemen, the international community has taken important steps to mitigate the pandemic's social-economic fallout, including through large-scale provision of emergency financing and the creation of debt relief instruments. But more is needed to close the recovery gap, address the risk of debt distress, and secure a better future for our children and for ourselves. The recommendations in today's new report point to a way forward. First, the international community must urgently address financing gaps and rising debt risks. It would be a tragedy if donors increase their military expenditure at the expense of official development assistance and climate action. And it would be a tragedy if developing countries continue to default at the expense of investments in social services and climate resilience. Second, policymakers must ensure that financing is aligned with the SDGs and climate action. This includes public budgets, tax systems, regulatory frameworks, and corporate reporting requirements. Climate-related risks should also be integrated into debt contracts and financial frameworks. And third, we must improve information ecosystems. This will not only help policymakers improve planning, better manage our risks, and combat illicit financial flows, it will also help our markets to better evaluate sovereign risks, including the impact of credit ratings. Across the board, we must also take steps to improve our global financial system to ensure that it reduces inequality while increasing resilience. And as things stand now, those member states that have the power of the global financial system appear to be moving in the opposite direction. The Secretary-General's biennial summit of UN member states with the G20, the international financial institutions and other key stakeholders, as laid out in the SG's Our Common Agenda report, will aim to change this course. It certainly isn't too late. The the Secretary-General is strongly committed to helping galvanise the collective action that is needed for our countries to recover better and to strive towards a healthier, more peaceful and more sustainable future that leaves no one behind. And so, my pleasure to introduce the report. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, DSG. We'll go first to ED Letter, Associated Press.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this briefing. A couple of questions. First, you warned about diverting money for aid, national aid, and climate from expanding military expenditures. Is this something you're worried about, especially in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine? And secondly, you talk about debt relief. This is an issue that's been going on for decades. What specifically would you like to see done to try and bring up the economies of debt-ridden developing countries? And just one final factual question. You say in 2021, 77 more million people fell into extreme poverty compared to 2019. What was the 2019 figure? I don't see it readily here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and great questions. Yes, of course, worried about the arms expenditure. Everyone is expected to spend there to protect those in Ukraine, but if we're taking away from overseas development assistance, from the rest of the conflicts, the humanitarian crises, the development, then this is not going to work. What we need is additionality. And not to take one from the other. Already it is insufficient. Already we have seen a slide in ODA, and now's not the time. We are off track. We were off track before COVID. It was exacerbated by COVID, and now there are the global implications which will set us back again on energy, on food, and financing for it. So big message there. We need more resources and not one that compete with each other. The debt relief, of course, you're right, it's been an issue that has been right at the very beginning of the pandemic. There were many solutions that were put forward. The DSSI was one of those to give some flexibility for countries and create the fiscal space they needed to respond immediately to the pandemic. This, I believe, needs to be extended. We need to see debt relief. We also need to see debt restructuring. But the conversation on debt needs to go deeper in a way that looks at how we create the space for investments, and that we are not seeing a debt versus investments. That has to be addressed in a much more holistic way. In many of the institutions, it is not always favorable, the frameworks that are created to deal with debt. And in many cases, those conditionalities are not useful to those countries that are trying to engage with our financial institutions. It's why the SG is asking for us to really look at the financial architecture and to see how more equitable that can be. We cannot possibly have countries today who are borrowing at 4 times the rate of others that have, and they don't have. This is a constraint that we are all faced with, but perhaps Navid might want to respond to that. The 77 million falling into extreme poverty, this is about 200 million more than we had at the beginning of the pandemic. So, math.
Navi, did you want to add something?
I don't.
Navi, did you want to add something? Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan. On the debt issue, the United Nations for the last so many decades has maintained sovereign debt architecture is flawed, deeply flawed. Immediate measures, I draw your attention to pages 147, 148 of the report, what we have said. And the Secretary General has maintained since May 2020 immediate measures on debt servicing. DSISI was a good step forward, but we need standstill agreements. Second, common framework has to be streamlined and made quicker in terms of delivery. Third, the private creditors are still not on board. We need to bring them on board in addressing the long-term architectural problems. TSC mentioned there is a proposal in the report on our common agenda what architectural problems need to be solved. And I draw your attention to the UN repeated resolutions, responsibilities of borrowers and lenders, contractual agreements, 33 years old, we need to revise them. And of course, debt sustainability assessments need to bring into account the investment in the SDGs and countries' ability to also invest in their people. So there are a number of very concrete proposals, immediate, medium-term, and long-term. Thank you.
Ibtisam and then Joe Klein.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. Good to see you again. So my question is about the role you see for trade. How could it be helpful? And at the same time, how worried are you that that could also be a problem for environment, depending on how that goes? And if you could go also, when it comes to trade, on women empowerment, especially when trading with the Global South, etc. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is one of the areas that right from the pandemic, we have seen huge impact. And women are hit first when it comes to the supply chains that we speak to. And I think this report is very clear about how we can begin to tackle that. And so even in the response that we have now, we are finding that the trade barriers, we are finding that the collapse of the supply chains, the inability of us to come together to reinforce some of these gaps is becoming more and more constraining on many economies. If we take the food systems, for instance, the trade that we have just for fertilizer, what we have is right now is looking at 500 million farmers that need, and most of them women, small-scale farmers, production, the farming season, and this has been considerably affected by the supply chains, and that I think in the context of trade is going to be a very big lesson for us to first of all look at the interdependency and to look at the production capacities within different regions and countries, and as we did with the vaccine conversation, to try to come back on making that more equitable. But no.
Thank you. Joe Klein, and then we'll go News Agency Unagi.
Yes, Joseph Klein from Canada Free Press. I have two related questions. First of all, particularly as we're seeing inflation take hold in the United States, but also globally, and considering the fact that interest rates, at least from the private sector, reflect market risk. So I'd like your comment on the question of whether it really is inequitable, considering variable levels of risk of repayment for countries that are at higher risk of defaulting to have a higher interest rate, and also the related impact that you see of inflation and interest rates going up, including in the United States. And related to that is the statement, at least in the press release, you mentioned rebounding of private investment in 2021. Do you see that trend continuing, particularly in China and the United States in 2022, considering the lockdowns that are occurring in Shanghai and other parts of China, cutting off of supply chains, and what some economists are predicting in the United States is an impending recession? So I'd appreciate it if you can comment on those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll leave the interest rates to Navid, but on the rebounding in the private sector investment, I don't think that we've had a better time in the engagement that we've had with the private sector through the different initiatives to keep them engaged and to keep us looking for alternatives in trying first to address the pandemic or to address the fallout of the crises and the alternative routes that we want to invest in many of the transitions that we speak to. whether they're climate and they will be energy associated as well, or some of the financing arrangements that need to change. So I think the engagement of the private sector, we will see step back, but I think that there are many more opportunities to invest in parallel opportunities for the transitions. And those transitions in Africa and Asia, we are seeing a lot of engagement, in fact, today in India, engagement in the private sector on renewable energy, addressing the energy crisis and trying to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. So not just automatics, we are recognizing we have to use more fossil fuel today, but parallel we are looking also for the transitions for that, and that's with the private sector.
Thank you.
Also, my question on the market assessment of variable risks in terms of the setting of interest rates and the impact of rising interest rates on your projections for this year and the foreseeable future. Thank you.
First of all, on the interest rates, during the pandemic, developed countries were able to borrow money at 1%. Developing country, 8%. And we did analysis. If you look at the credit worthiness of a country in Europe and Africa, some countries are not far apart, but the borrowing rate is 4 to 5% higher than in Europe. So this, and the Secretary General has not minced his words, has clearly conveyed this has to be addressed. So one factor which plays instrumental role is the credit rating agencies. 3 dominant agencies. Their methodology, and we have been very constructive in talking to them. They were here with us at the end of last month. Very open conversation that it's not only CRAs, it's the whole ecosystem of sovereign debt that has to be revisited. But CRAs, what can they do? First of all, they should be more transparent than they are right now on developing countries' ratings. Second, inject long-termism. Also give countries credit if they're investing in the SDGs. Their ratings should be a little bit lifted because of long-term prospects. Third, in addition to your short-term ratings, which they do because they are compelled to do it, it's the users who want them. Bring in scenarios of complementing that long-term prospects for a country to return their debt if they borrow it. So we are working with credit rating agencies to improve the system so the African borrowing costs go significantly lower. Your question on the interest rate, all over the world they're going up. Our challenge is it's a supply shock, disruption of supply chains, coupled with massive fiscal stimuli. So demand has gone up, supply is disrupted, which we did not witness in 2008 and 2009. Supply lines were open, fiscal stimulus did not lead to inflation. This time both sides have converged. So if you want to supply side is what supply side is. What you can do is lower tariffs to increase supplies, physically improve supply disruption, address supply disruption. On the monetary side, driven by financial considerations, political considerations, they have to show they're acting. So interest rates have to go up to demonstrate that we are controlling the demand side by shortening the supply of money. And also, Fed will also roll back its APP. The inflationary pressures, we have seen the figures that came out today, are going to push monetary authority to do something very significant. It has impacts, yes. Capital flight, capital will become expensive for countries to borrow, but economics is all about choices. We don't have too many choices left, so we need to use both monetary policy as far as we can and fiscal measures to minimize the impact on vulnerable populations, on exposed economies. But it's a tough challenge to deal with, and central bankers are doing their best. Thank you.
Thank you. Agency of Nigeria, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead, please. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Cecilia from News Agency of Nigeria. Yeah, according to the report, it's there's some progress made by developed countries. The worry is about developing countries. So my question is, how possible is it now to achieve SDG in the presence of challenge posed by COVID-19 and other challenges in developing countries, the high debt profile, mass illiteracy, poor health infrastructure, as well as performance of child rights, especially in Nigeria and other developing countries. So how possible it is to achieve the SDG? Then secondly, are you satisfied by the level of institutional and corporate world support for SDG in developing countries? And also, if many countries in developing countries fail to achieve the MDGs, so what is the guarantee that the SDG will be achieved?
Thank you. Well, first of all, the MDGs are seen as unfinished business, and they're the first 6 goals of the SDGs. So, as we have moved with the new framing of sustainable development, you will see that we didn't leave any of the unfinished business behind. And it's important because those first 6 goals are what should come from responses of domestic resource mobilization to pay for basic rights on social protection systems, health, education, water and sanitation. So very important. Then that is happening, not happening at the scale at which it should. But the multiplicity of crises that have happened so far have put countries behind on the SDGs. That doesn't mean that we give up with them. There are still, every day, we are working on different scenarios and opportunities for investments to come in, either on the back of climate action, where we're looking, for instance, in developing countries, adaptation, the energy and the food and the digital transitions, and looking for more private sector involvement. Some good signs were seen in COP26 when over 2 trillion, I believe, was of managed funds was committed to a greener and more sustainable investment pattern. That has to be called, we have to look at that. We have to look at that in where is that going to happen, how is it going to happen, and this is where the SG set up a group which is chaired by Catherine McKenna to see how real those commitments are. I think we get a lot of commitments, but how much of it lands? Humanitarian, how much of it lands in development as well? So we are pushing. You will see many headline messages tomorrow that will target the spring meetings, will target the G20 meetings, will target where those that speak about resources that need to move and create the enabling environment should take some notice of some of the policy changes that need to be made. So I think that attention, certainly from the multilateral system, is on the institutional support to try to find different pathways to getting finance to the SDGs. Are we satisfied with those that have and the flows that we need to have go towards developing countries? No, we're not. We didn't see it in the response to COVID. We have not seen it in the response on the socioeconomic impacts. And I believe that unless, as we are trying now to get ahead of this crisis that is coming from the war in Ukraine, it has already started, then we will be facing not just countries that will have many millions more in hunger and many million not going to school, because this will affect girls, this will affect women. It will be a dire situation. We have the wherewithal in this world today to make those political decisions to deliver on the SDGs. What we need to do is to find the configurations and the opportunities to put leaders together to agree this. And this is a very difficult and tense time as we deal with the war in Ukraine. So I don't give up with the SDGs. I still think that there is hope for us to achieve them. We still have 8 years. We don't want to fail now. Let's just keep moving, keep bringing together the different expertise and institutions together.
Thank you. Pam Falk, CBS News.
Thank you so much for the briefing. It's good to see you both here. My question is about Ukraine, since you've brought it up. There is a move afoot, particularly from the Ukrainian mission, that has written a letter to the Secretary General asking that the UN stop purchasing Russian aircraft, goods, about $270 million a year worth of procurement. from what I understand, that would take a different General Assembly resolution that would mandate other than best price. What is your view of the idea that Ukraine would like to stop spending what has been about over $2 billion since 2014 in purchases from Russia? Thank you.
I don't think there's any easy answer to that. This is a really complex situation, not black and white, and there are reasons why Ukraine would have that, have those asks of the Secretary General. But I think it's important that, whatever we do to restrict or to sanction, that we concentrate on the people that will be affected. Because this is painful for many. This is people going without food. This is people going without livelihoods. It has a global impact when one stops doing that, particularly as we've now found how dependent we are, a large percentage of food supplies to the rest of the world. So I think it has to be considered with great sense of responsibility to the wider impacts to the rest of the world.
Explain that. I just don't understand the answer a little bit. Who doesn't have the food? You mean by not purchasing from Russia, it would affect the way the UN's budget works?
Well, you know that we have over 50% of our humanitarian budget is on food that comes from Russia and Ukraine. And so your humanitarian response would be affected. And that's people all over the world who are dependent on that. That's people where we're not speaking just about the livelihoods. These are lives that we're trying to save. And so I think that while we want to put a sanction or a restriction in place, we need to think about the impacts of it on the greater number of people.
And there wouldn't be another place to purchase from?
Well, not as we see it now.
Great. DSG Navid, thank you all very much. And then we'll start the daily briefing in about 15 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Good morning. I am pleased to be here with Senior Deputy Governor Rogers to discuss today's policy announcement and the Bank of Canada's monetary policy report. Russia's unprovoked, is there a problem? Okay, sorry. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is causing enormous human suffering, and our hearts go out to the Ukrainian people. The war has also introduced a major new source of uncertainty to the global outlook, and it is boosting already high inflation in many countries, including Canada. Against this background, we have three main messages this morning. Premièrement, l'économie canadienne est forte. En général, elle s'est remise de la pandémie et entre dans une phase de demande excédentaire. Deuxièmement, l'inflation est trop élevée. Elle dépasse nos attentes et va rester élevée pendant plus longtemps qu'on le pensait. Et troisièmement, on a besoin de taux d'intérêt plus élevés. Le taux directeur est notre principal outil pour maintenir l'équilibre économique et ramener l'inflation à la cible de 2%. Ce matin, on a relevé ce taux de 50 points de base pour le faire passer à 1%. Comme on l'a dit, les Canadiens devraient s'attendre à d'autres hausses. Let me reiterate these main messages in English. First, the Canadian economy is strong. Overall, the economy has fully recovered from the pandemic and is now moving into excess demand. Second, inflation is too high. It is higher than we expected, and it's going to be elevated for longer than we previously thought. And third, we need higher interest rates. Our policy interest rate is our primary tool to keep the economy in balance and bring inflation back to the 2% target. This morning, we raised our policy rate 50 basis points to 1%, and we indicated Canadians should expect further increases. Let me expand on each of these three themes. Recent data suggests the Canadian economy weathered the Omicron variant remarkably well, and the economy has considerable momentum going into the second quarter. A broad set of indicators suggests that our economy is now moving into excess demand. The labor market shows this clearly. Job growth has been strong. The unemployment rate is at a record low. Job vacancies are elevated, and wage growth has reached pre-pandemic levels. And businesses are also telling us they expect they'll need to increase wages further to keep and attract workers. Looking forward, momentum in most major spending components points to strong GDP growth this year. Canadians are spending more on services as public health measures ease, and spending on goods remains solid. Housing activity has remained strong and is expected to moderate, but to still elevated levels. Business investment and exports are both picking up, and higher prices for many of the commodities Canada exports are bringing more income into the country. Higher interest rates should moderate growth in domestic spending as we move through this year and next. At the same time, Canada's productive capacity should be helped by robust investment, improved labor productivity, and higher immigration. Putting all this together, the bank forecasts the Canadian economy will grow 4.25% this year, before moderating to 3.25% next year and 2.25% in 2024. The bank's primary focus is inflation. We are acutely aware that already high inflation has risen further above our target. The invasion of Ukraine has driven up the prices of energy and other commodities, and the war is further disrupting global supply chains. We're also concerned about the broadening of price pressures in Canada. With about 2/3 of CPI components growing above 3%, Canadians are feeling inflation across their household budgets, from gas to groceries to rent. CPI inflation hit a 3-decade high of 5.7% in February, above what we projected in the January Monetary Policy Report. We now expect inflation to average almost 6% in the first half of 2022 and remain well above our 1% to 3% control range throughout this year. We then expect it to ease to about 2.5% in the second half of 2023 before returning to the 2% target in 2024. With inflation broadening and remaining higher for longer, the risk is that Canadians start to think that high inflation will become entrenched. This leads me to my third point. Interest rates are increasing. Raising the policy rate is our main tool to moderate demand, prevent a persistent buildup in domestic price pressures, and keep inflation expectations moored on the 2% target. The economy can handle higher interest rates, and they are needed. Increases in the bank's policy rate raise the interest rates that banks and other lenders charge their customers. These include rates on business loans, consumer loans, and mortgage loans. With increases in the policy rate, interest paid on savings products will move up as well. By making borrowing more expensive and increasing the return on savings, a higher policy rate dampens spending, reducing overall demand in the economy. And with demand starting to run ahead of the economy's supply capacity, we need this to happen to bring the economy into balance and cool domestic inflation. We also need higher interest rates to keep Canadians' expectations of inflation anchored on the target, so that as global inflationary pressures from higher oil prices and clogged supply chains abate, inflation in Canada falls back towards the target range. We are committed to using our policy rate to return inflation to target, and will do so forcefully if needed. Let me now say a few words about the Governing Council's deliberations. On a bien sûr parlé de l'impact économique de l'invasion de l'Ukraine. La guerre a fait monter les prix de l'énergie et leur volatilité. Elle a aussi perturbé les échanges commerciaux, accru l'incertitude et causé de la volatilité sur les marchés financiers. Cela va peser sur la croissance mondiale, surtout en Europe de l'Est. L'impact du conflit sur la croissance au Canada devrait être faible pour deux raisons. D'abord, nos liens économiques avec l'Ukraine et la Russie sont limités. Et ensuite, même si la guerre a réduit la croissance mondiale, elle a fait augmenter la demande et les prix des produits de base que le Canada exporte, comme le pétrole, la potasse et le blé. On a aussi discuté de l'impact de l'inflation plus élevée sur les Canadiens et leurs attentes d'inflation. Les Canadiens s'attendent à ce que l'inflation reste élevée pendant plus longtemps, mais ils anticipent une baisse de l'inflation et leurs attentes à long terme restent ancrées à la cible de 2%. Finally, we discussed the impact of increasing our policy interest rate. While we've been clear with Canadians that they should expect a rising path for interest rates, seeing their mortgage rates and other borrowing costs increase can be worrying. We will be assessing the impacts of higher interest rates on the economy carefully. We also discussed where rates might end up. How high will they need to go? I know many Canadians have the same question, so let me share the Governing Council's thinking. Canadians should expect interest rates to continue to rise toward more normal settings. By more normal, we mean within the range we consider for a neutral rate of interest that neither stimulates nor weighs on the economy. The neutral rate isn't something we can measure directly. We have to estimate it. And our estimate is between 2 and 3%. Today, we raised our policy rate to 1%, still well below neutral. This is also below the pre-pandemic policy rate of 1.75%. Il faut se rappeler qu'on a une cible d'inflation et non une cible de taux d'intérêt. Le conseil de direction n'est pas un mode de pilote automatique. Il n'a pas de destination préétablie pour le taux directeur. Le niveau de le taux atteindra va dépendre de la réponse de l'économie et de l'évolution des perspectives d'inflation. Au moment d'entrer dans cette phase de demande excédentaire, l'économie est en plein essor et l'inflation est élevée. On s'est engagé à ramener l'inflation à la cible. It's important to remember we have an inflation target, not an interest rate target. This means Governing Council is not on autopilot to a pre-established destination for the policy interest rate. How high interest rates will go will depend on how the economy responds and how the outlook for inflation evolves. The economy has entered this period of excess demand with considerable momentum and high inflation, and we are committed to getting inflation back to target. If demand responds quickly to higher rates and inflationary pressures moderate, it may be appropriate to pause our tightening once we get closer to the neutral rate and take stock. On the other hand, we may need to take rates modestly above neutral for a period to bring demand and supply back into balance and inflation back to target. We will, of course, be updating our views on the outlook for the economy and inflation as new data come in, and we will continue to share our assessments so Canadians can make informed decisions. Let me conclude with a brief word on quantitative tightening. We expanded our balance sheet during the pandemic, first to help restore financial market functioning and provide liquidity to the financial system, and then to add further stimulus to support recovery. Last November, we stopped increasing our holdings of Government of Canada bonds and have been in the reinvestment phase since then. Today, we announce we're entering the next phase, quantitative tightening, or QT. Effective April 25th, we will stop purchasing Government of Canada bonds to replace our holdings as they mature, so our balance sheet will shrink. This will put upward pressure on borrowing costs further at the yield curve, complementing the increases in our policy rate. And with that,
bonjour tout le monde. I am so honored
Good morning, one and all.
to be joining you here today at CFB Trenton, which is on the traditional territory of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, also known as Kanien'kehá:ka community of the Tyendinaga. This is my first visit to this community since being appointed as the Minister of National Defense, and I truly appreciate the opportunity to learn more about how the Canadian Armed Forces members stationed here are keeping Canada and North America safe and helping to uphold our collective security. including the work that they are doing in response to the crisis in Ukraine. Since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 months ago, CFB Trenton has served as the departure point for much of the military aid that Canada has been providing to Ukraine to fight and win this war. Malgré une situation en constante évolution, je sais que vous restez prêts à continuer à défendre le Canada et nos alliés, amis et partenaires. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui pour annoncer la prochaine phase de la réponse des forces armées canadiennes à la guerre en Ukraine. To help address the growing crisis at the border between Poland and Ukraine, I am announcing today the deployment of up to 150 Canadian Armed Forces personnel, with approximately 100 personnel in the immediate term who will assist Poland's efforts to support and care for Ukrainians fleeing violence. The majority will come from Edmonton and Kingston and through here in Trenton in the coming days. Pour aider à faire face à la crise à la frontière entre la Pologne et l'Ukraine, j'annonce aujourd'hui le déploiement de 100 membres des forces armées canadiennes qui pourraient être augmentés jusqu'à 150 membres pour assister la Pologne dans ses efforts de soutien envers les Ukrainiens qui fuient la violence. La majorité du groupe partiront d'Edmonton et de Kingston pour transiter ici à Trenton dans les prochains jours. Now, over the next few months, our military will provide support across 3 lines of effort. First, we will be deploying armed forces members to reception centers across Poland to assist with the immediate care and processing of Ukrainian refugees. This is the largest component of our deployment to Poland. Our people will provide general support, spiritual services, and limited medical care enabled by Ukrainian-speaking CAF personnel. Second, we will deploy a number of members in support of a Polish-led humanitarian assistance task force. We will work with military members and other government representatives from Canada, from Poland, and from other allies to synchronize efforts from more than 100 multinational humanitarian agencies to ensure that Ukrainians fleeing the war receive the best support possible. And third, we will assist Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada by acting as a liaison with the Polish Defense Forces as IRCC works so that thousands more Ukrainians can continue to resettle in this country. Premièrement, nous allons déployer des membres des forces armées canadiennes dans des centres d'accueil en Pologne afin de contribuer aux soins immédiats et au traitement des réfugiés ukrainiens. Il s'agit de la composante la plus importante de notre déploiement en Pologne. Notre personnel fournira un soutien général, des services spirituels et des soins médicaux limités avec l'aide de membres ukrainophones de forces armées canadiennes. Deuxièmement, nous en enverrons une partie à l'appui d'une force opérationnelle d'aide humanitaire dirigée par la Pologne. Et troisièmement, nous aiderons Immigration, Réfugiés et Citoyenneté Canada en assurant la liaison avec les forces de défense polonaises alors que IRCC travaille pour que des milliers d'autres Ukrainiens puissent continuer et se réinstaller au Canada. These efforts are being carried out as part of Operation Reassurance, Canada's contribution to NATO's assurance and deterrence measures in Central and Eastern Europe, which we recently expanded and extended over the past few months. Through Operation Reassurance and the international response to the war in Ukraine, we have shown how strong and effective we can be when we work on a united front. It is more important than ever for Canada to stay engaged with our allies and partners. And through Budget 2022, we have committed another $500 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. And that is on top of the $110 million that we have pledged thus far, so that our Ukrainian friends have the equipment that they need to keep fighting this war and to win. Nous fournissons également jusqu'à $1 milliard en nouvelles ressources et en prêt au gouvernement ukrainien pour assurer la résilience et sa stabilité, ainsi que des nouvelles mesures visant à réinstaller temporairement les Ukrainiens ici au Canada, dont une voie vers la résidence permanente pour les demandeurs admissibles. En collaboration avec la communauté internationale, nous avons également imposé une série de sanctions à l'encontre de Poutine et ceux qui le soutiennent. Nous continuons à soutenir le peuple ukrainien dans son ensemble et nous demandons des comptes à Poutine et à ceux qui le soutiennent. As this crisis continues to unfold, we will keep working with the international community to respond effectively, and we will keep ensuring that our military has what it needs to protect and to defend Canada. To this end, through Budget 2022, we announced more than $8 billion in new funding for our military and the communications security establishment. We will also undertake a review of defense policy to ensure that we remain ready to meet current and emerging threats here at home and around the world. In many ways, the world is a much less safe place than it was 2 years ago and certainly 2 months ago. And we must take stock and take action in order to remain a valuable, reliable ally and partner for decades to come. To conclude, I cannot imagine the heartbreak felt by millions of Ukrainians who are forced to flee Putin's shelling and bombing, the heartbreak of thousands of Canadians with loved ones who remain in Ukraine now. But in the face of unspeakable acts of violence carried out against innocent civilians and of despicable acts and attacks on schools, apartment buildings, train stations in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Bucha, Mariupol, and of tragic desperation, Canadians and our Canadian Armed Forces will continue to step up and offer a safe haven and to welcome with open arms the people of Ukraine, our friends. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech. Je pourrais demander à des questions si vous voulez. I can answer questions if you like.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now start the question and answer period from journalists who are here. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre. Journalists will have one question and one follow-up, and please state your name and outlet.
Okay. David Aiken, Global News. Good morning, Minister. I wonder if you could just maybe speak to the genesis of this particular mission, whether it was through a request from Polish authorities. I know the Prime Minister has spoken quite often to Ukraine's Prime Minister, Ukraine's President. Did we offer? Can you give us a sense of how this mission sort of came together?
Well, I'll start with the basic point that Canada stands with Ukraine. We've been one of the lead countries within NATO in terms of support for Ukraine, and we will continue to provide comprehensive humanitarian, economic, and military aid. In terms of today's announcement, the Prime Minister and I have been in close touch with our counterparts in Poland, as well as with the NATO alliance writ large, and we are committing these additional resources under Operation Reassurance, which is our mission in support of NATO's eastern flank.
Thank you. There were some reports, I think, from the CSE that the Russians, part of the Russian disinformation campaign, is to generate images that seem to purport to show Canadian forces actively engaged in combat I guess, in Ukraine, in the theater. Thinking about that, I wonder if you can comment, does that raise the threat level for some of the folks who are about to deploy, or for our folks already overseas right now? Has the threat level for our forces changed? I know you can't get into too much detail on that, but can you speak to that in general terms?
From the very beginning, we have been unified as a NATO alliance that we will do whatever is needed to ensure that we are supporting Ukraine, and also that we are making our respective contributions on the ground to the NATO alliance. And this mission in Poland is part of that commitment, and we very much are aware of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that an attack on one is an attack on all. The threat level, of course, is one that we are constantly watching, and we will continue to do so. At the current time, we are confident that this is a mission that should be undertaken in the interests of humanitarian aid, in the interests of aiding our Polish allies, and in the interests of the NATO alliance writ large, as refugees are fleeing Ukraine, and this humanitarian support is needed in Poland immediately.
Thank you. Merci. Next question.
Hi, Minister. Tom Parry with CBC. You mentioned that there's going to be Ukrainian speakers going on this mission. I'm wondering if you can tell me how many of the people we're sending will be Ukrainian speakers, what they'll be doing. And as a second part of this question, you mentioned in the budget, or the budget talked about $500 million in further military aid for Ukraine. When do you think you're going to be getting some more detail on that? And if I could get you to answer in English and French, that'd be great.
Thank you so much for the question. On the first question regarding Ukrainian speakers, I will turn to Ryan. But on the second question, I have to admit I couldn't quite hear you. Can you speak?
Sure.
Right
it was about
the
the $500 million in weapons aid for Ukraine announced in the budget. When can we expect further details about what that's going to be?
Okay, I'll start with that, and then I'll hand over the mic on Ukrainian speakers in the forces. The budget, which came down just a week ago today, committed $500 million in military aid to Ukraine. That is on top of the $110 million of aid already that our government has committed. This aid should be conceived in various categories, which is how I think about it. The first category is CAF inventory, which we have largely drawn upon for the existing aid that we are sending. The second category is procurements from suppliers. We are actively engaged with a number of suppliers regarding additional procurements, and I will have more information to say about those discussions soon. I will say that they follow the type of negotiation and contract that we entered into for the cameras for drones that we announced a few weeks ago. We were asked by Ukraine directly to supply cameras for these drones. Within days, we had a contract in place and cameras sent over to Ukraine. That is the type of effort we will continue to do under that second category. And the third category of aid that we are examining is in conjunction with our allies, working together collaboratively with our allies in terms of possibly pooling our aid so that we can send over aid as efficiently as possible as a collective. And in that vein, we did have a donors conference with which was hosted by the United Kingdom recently, and we are very much aligned as NATO allies to ensure that we are working efficiently as possible, given the urgency of the situation and the fact that Minister Resnikov is in touch with me almost daily in terms of what is needed for Ukraine, and that's what I'm working to fulfill in terms of a list.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.